It has begun. Ukraine's much-awaited counteroffensive is underway. Kyiv made the announcement in a rather dramatic fashion.
Україна, рідна земля мати. Господь, Отець наш Небесний, благословіть.
Благословіть!
Я йду знищувати!
Ворогів землі рідної! Ми своїх братів! Гвалтівників моїх посадців!
Нехай рука моя буде твердою!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Нехай око моє буде ясним!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Нехай зброя моя буде справною!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Нехай воля моя буде сталь!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Україно, рідна земля мати!
Господь, Отець наш Небесний!
Благословіть!
Наш рішучий наступ! Нашу священну помсту!
Нашу святу перемогу!
Yes, a Hollywood-styled video to announce the counteroffensive. But Ukraine is going to need more than that. This is perhaps Zelensky's last chance. The war in Ukraine began 15 months ago. So far, Russia has dictated the pace of this conflict. Kyiv is trying to turn the tables. It wants to gain an upper hand and push Russia into submission. That's the objective of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Kyiv has spent months preparing for this. The expectations are high. So what are Ukraine's plans? Tonight, we'll tell you. We begin with what's happening on the ground. Ukraine says preliminary operations are underway. There is a spike in missile attacks by Ukraine. Where? Inside Russian-occupied territories. Those areas that Ukraine calls its own. Ukraine is hitting Russian military positions there. An advisor to Zelensky has spoken out. He says, and I quote, "It's a complicated process, which is not a matter of one day or a certain date or a certain hour. It's an ongoing process of deoccupation, and certain processes are already happening, like destroying supply lines or blowing up depots behind the lines." So, those are the targets. Russian military command centers, supply depots, basically anything that helps the Russian forces maintain their positions. This is Russia's military infrastructure on the front lines. Ukraine is trying to dismantle it. The goal is to weaken the Russian forces before the Ukrainian troops can move forward and engage the Russian troops in direct combat. This is what military strategists call, quote-unquote, shaping operations. What are shaping operations? These are a set of military tactics. They are used ahead of a major offensive, either to weaken the enemy or to distract them on the battlefield. Ukraine could be trying to do both. With its own shaping operations, what will be Kyiv's next step? They're not saying much, presumably to retain the element of surprise. But reports say Kyiv's focus will remain on the east and south, where the Russian forces have dug in. I'm talking about this area. From Crimea in the south to the Donbass in the east, this entire region is in Russian control. Ukrainian forces will strike in these areas. That's a guarantee. What do they hope to achieve? Kyiv has a specific aim for this counteroffensive. They want to influence the outcome of the war. What are the possible scenarios? Number one, Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful. That would mean Russia losing control of occupied territories. Russian forces will be forced to move back, and Kyiv will regain complete control of lost lands. That's unlikely, because Russian forces still have considerable resources to hold their ground. Scenario number two is a partial victory for Ukraine. What would that look like? Ukraine regains some of the lost territories. With that, they push Russia to negotiate. In that situation, Ukraine would have the upper hand, and they'll be able to dictate terms with some help from its Western partners. Scenario number three would be a failed offensive. That wouldn't play out well for Kyiv. If the counteroffensive fails, Western support for Ukraine will certainly decline, and they could be forced to accept a deal on Russia's terms. So the stakes are high for everyone. Russia is putting pressure on Ukraine. It has intensified attacks on Kyiv. Once again, several explosions were heard this morning. Overnight, Russia launched 40 cruise missiles and about 35 drones. There were no casualties, but some buildings were left damaged. Zelensky has spoken out. He says his country suffered the largest Russian attack yet.
Today, our state went through one of the largest Russian attacks by Shahed drones, 54 drones at a time. Almost all of them were shot down. Unfortunately, there were some hits in the Zhytomyr region. We will do everything to help restore what has been destroyed.
Zelensky is now pushing Ukraine's parliament. He wants sanctions against Iran. Don't know how much will that help. Meanwhile, Russia has issued fresh threats to the West. This is overtraining Ukrainian pilots on F-16 jets. Russian Foreign Minister called this an unacceptable escalation.
Of course, this is an unacceptable escalation. I think that there are still reasonable people in the West who understand this, but everything is dictated by Washington, London, and their satellites that are inside the European Union, primarily the Baltic countries, Poland, who are implementing the task set by the United States on the ground to weaken Russia, to inflict a strategic defeat on it.
So that's the message from Russia. Expect the war of words to intensify as Ukraine pushes ahead with this counteroffensive.